Mr. Speaker, that member that just spoke can turn a blind eye, along with his colleagues, as much as he likes. But the reality is that National have failed New Zealand when it comes to housing. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, that National have failed New Zealanders when it comes to housing. In West Auckland the other day, and Alfred Ngaro knows all about West Auckland because he's trying to run for a seat out there, I heard from a very reliable source, one of our health organisations.
I'm going to actually let the member start again, but I want to warn Mr Ngaro he's not allowed to wander around waving his arms in the air and interjecting while he's on his feet when he hasn't got a call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Starting again.
I heard a very disturbing thing from one of our health providers in West Auckland the other day, and that is that the Waitemata DHB is on the verge of having to release people into homelessness. Mr. Speaker, these are people who are still recovering from illnesses, do not have homes to go into, there is no emergency housing, there is very little or a lack of social housing, and Mr. Speaker, they are on the verge of having to release people, sick people who are still recovering, into homelessness. Now, is that side of the House still proud of their accomplishments when it comes to housing when that is the case, Mr. Speaker? I can't imagine why they would be. We heard from Alfred Ngaro saying that Labour is opposed to building up the community housing providers. I just need to make the point, we are not opposed to building up community housing provision. What we are opposed to is the national government flicking off Housing New Zealand houses to those social housing providers, Mr. Speaker, and not actually building up the stock, just passing the buck when it comes to the housing. And actually, Mr. Speaker, flicking off billions of dollars that belong to New Zealanders in terms of assets. That's what we're opposed to, Mr. Speaker. We're not opposed at all to building up the community housing providers. I sat through the Select Committee with my colleague Phil Twyford, and there were a number of things that came up that were disturbing, and I just want to point out one small thing before I get on to the two main reasons for why we're not supporting this bill. One of the things that came up that a lot of the submitters were also concerned about is that with this bill, all of the decision-making power with respect to the transactions in terms of passing the Housing New Zealand houses over to the community housing providers, all the decision-making power lays with the Minister. But, Mr. Speaker, all of the accountability and responsibility for the success of that transaction lies with Housing New Zealand. So the Minister has all the power to make the decision, but will not be held accountable if anything goes wrong in the transaction, despite the fact she is imposing that decision on Housing New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, I can't see how in any way that is fair, and actually a lot of the submitters agreed that that does not seem fair to them as well. If the Minister is going to have the power to make these decisions, then the Minister needs to be liable if anything goes wrong with those transactions, Mr. Speaker. It's not only Labour here that opposes this bill. We oppose it along with our Green and our New Zealand First colleagues, and there, as I said, are two main reasons for our opposition to the bill. The first is that the bill enables a policy, as I've already outlined, as Phil Twyford's already outlined, that we disagree with. The sale of a large proportion of the country's stock of state houses is central to the government's policy. Our view is that the housing crisis, more than anything, demands a substantial increase in the number of houses affordable for people on very low incomes. In addition, there is an urgent need to improve the quality of state housing, in particular to make it warm and dry. We have heard through the media, we have heard with some of the reports that have come out from the government that actually there has been a decline in the number of people on the social housing register. Well, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that there has not been a decline in the demand for people trying to get on the register. What's happening is actually there's a block right at the beginning for people to get access to the register in the first place, to even be considered for a Housing New Zealand house, Mr. Speaker. We've seen instances where the government has had the opportunity to build up the stock of Housing New Zealand houses, and I want to cite one in my own electorate, and that being with respect to the Waterview connection project, where for that project, Housing New Zealand sold houses to the New Zealand Transport Agency so they could be used for that project. They were no longer required for the project. Housing New Zealand had the opportunity to buy those houses back, but instead chose not to, and so those houses went up for private sale. How irresponsible is that, Mr. Speaker? It's irresponsible because of the fact that there are hundreds of families in that particular area trying to get into homes, and yet when they had an opportunity to buy back the houses that they sold for a particular project, they decided not to. Mr. Speaker, there is an urgent need to improve the quality of state housing, in particular to make it warm and dry, and we see that in our offices every day with our constituents who come through with health issues that have come about because of the state of the housing that they're in. And what has been really disappointing is listening to Minister Paula Bennett rave on in the media about the fact that people should be grateful when they're offered a home and that they will be denied the opportunity to take up any home and in fact removed from the list if they turn down a house. Mr. Speaker, there are so many good reasons why people turn down houses, and yet we have Minister Bennett stigmatising these families. And actually, in the House here, she talked about 2 people who had turned down a house because of the fact that they didn't like the decor. 2 people in the whole country that had turned down a house for a reason like that. And yet we know of hundreds of families who have turned down houses because of things like they are not in close vicinity of the schools that their kids go to, because of the fact that it's too far away from the work or the job that they have and so they wouldn't be able to travel there, because, Mr. Speaker, it is too close to a former abusive partner that they can't be near because it's dangerous for them and their children, because, Mr. Speaker, it's not fenced appropriately and it would be dangerous for their small children to live in that house. More often than not, people have good reasons for turning down Housing New Zealand houses.
I apologise for interrupting the member, but this debate is interrupted and is set down for resumption next sitting day. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Tuesday, the 16th of February.